We miss you too.
So if you didn't know, yeah, and Ijuma, we got to show them our one picture we took together. Ijuma and I spent several real days in real time, in real life together.
We did.
I think we took one picture to document our adventures, and we were supposed to do Facebook Live about a transformative talk, but we didn't. I think we went to a spa. Oh,
yeah, we went to a
spa. Oh, yep, there it is. We were driving. All I did was drive Ijuma around Ohio, but that's another story. She's still laughing. She's still talking to me. Yes. And Isela is coming, so don't y'all worry. Today we are going to talk about a hot topic. I was going to call it something else, and I had another adjective, but I'll just call it a hot topic of learning loss, propaganda, rhetoric, and a few other things like that. But before we do it, hey, do you want to ground us? And
sure.
I'll agreement.
Or I could do the agreement and let Isela come.
Oh, hey, if I have to go outside of my comfort, you got to go outside of yours. But I doubt that's outside of your comfort.
No. All right.
All right.
So wherever you are right now, just kind of return to your body. Maybe put your feet on the floor if that feels good. Relax your shoulders. And just take a breath with us. In through your nose. And out through your mouth. And we're just going to be present with each other as we have another transformative talk.
Yeah, because I feel like sometimes these can, they're full of paradoxes, for sure. And, I was talking with Julie Costin this morning, and it's like, I don't want the burden always to fall to the educator. And so as much as we are going to talk about how things like learning loss or achievement gaps or even standards and school improvement in general are sort of distractions from the need for systemic change, I sometimes feel like when we talk to the choir or when we gather, it also sort of puts more responsibility on educators. So maybe that will lead me to maybe the value or the agreement today is that community is going to be more important than ever. I know we pick that one often, Ijuma. I just feel like that one's calling to me today so that we can be brave, or that we can engage in restorative justice, or we can go to our growing edge. Any of those others are going to just so need the community to not get distracted. So that's how I feel today. The agreement is that figure out who your community is.
Yes.
When you started this work, Ijuma, did you start pretty small, like is in your education world, not necessarily in your life world, but did you start like with your co-teachers? Did you start with, how did you kind of do that?
I started with my co-teachers and like another teacher that was in the program that I was in. Like, I was trying to talk to everybody, and then just took whoever was interested and whoever wanted to, have those discussions or, problem solve together.
Yeah.
If I anytime I wanted to speak out about something, like I would go to that person and practice. Like, okay, I'm thinking about going to the director to talk to her about this policy.
Yeah.
I think it's unfair. And so here's what I'm thinking I'm going to say. Here's what I think I'm going to say. It does get that practice in.
That's what I just wrote down was practice. Yeah.
Especially then, like I never thought like this would be my work, that I would be speaking and doing professional development. I'm introverted. I didn't want a lot of attention on me. So it took a lot to, to build. I had the courage, like I wasn't afraid, but
Yeah.
it just was very outside of my comfort zone to speak out,
Yeah.
and to speak up when something wasn't right, and to be a fuller advocate,
Mm.
for children, and to go against, how it's always been. I think that was
Mm.
my biggest when I was a classroom educator. Well, we've always done it like this,
Yeah.
and to go against that in big and small ways, and not like ruin relationships.
Yeah, because
Just have people be a little bit mad.
these are like big stakes. And I think even sometimes when we might go to our supervisor or our manager or our principal, it's always like, then they're like, oh gosh, now I have to take it to the superintendent or
Hmm.
the owner of the company or
Right.
the school board. And then they're like, oh, I can't do anything because this is the legislature has done
Hmm.
it. Let's say you make it all the way to your state legislature. They're like, hey, it's the feds, it's
Right.
Secretary of Education. So I feel like sometimes we get stuck in fast forwarding that
Hmm.
all I'm going to do is literally piss off my supervisor and there's not going to be a change.
Right. And so the other thing that I learned, just in advocacy work, was to bring a solution, right?
Okay.
Like if I bring a problem, then I was like, well, I think this is what we should do.
Let's dive
And
into that one because this is, oh, here comes Isela. This is perfect. Like, let's see if this works for her.
okay.
All right, Isela, you did it.
Hooray. Welcome.
She had so many things open on her computer that she couldn't come in. We
I
already
did it.
grounded ourselves, Isela, and we already have our community agreement. We're just moving
Okay.
right along. And where we were just headed was we were just talking about how to come if you see something that you want to advocate for. So let's take this idea of learning loss, which we haven't defined or talked about. But let's say as an educator or a parent or whatever, that it doesn't make any sense and that it's distracting us from the bigger picture or the conversations that we need to be having at this point. And you get your community and or a friend and you practice saying something to them. Ijuma just said, come to your wherever you're going to take it with a solution. So that's where we are, but maybe we should step back and talk a little bit about learning loss as a phrase, what we're not thrilled about it,
No,
and
we're
then come
not.
back to, okay, how would we take that to somebody? That's what I'd love to make sure we do today is how would we take this about it and what could we do?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So
So
I'm trying not to be like tinfoil hat and like it's a conspiracy from the testing and assessment people trying to, be in a deficit model, right? Because it's like,
yeah.
oh, we lost something. And so here's something to fix it and to gain back what we've lost.
Hmm.
I think my feeling about, let me just tell you, share with you what happened recently.
Okay.
My daughter started school last week. So this is her second weekend. And I was at the front office, first day of school, and I was waiting. I had to turn in she takes digestive enzymes. And so I had to log that in. Well, the office was packed, like with people and kids with like messed up schedules. It's like middle school, high school so she's 13. And there was a dad sitting in there with the assessment results. So we have the AZ merit results, and he was sitting in the waiting area for the principal. And he was engaging in a conversation with the other parents who were waiting there for other reasons, it seemed. And, I was just standing, because I know how crazy busy things are. My thing doesn't need to be handled in that moment. So I was there for a little bit of time. And the receptionist came over to just figure out what, are we okay where we're at? Who needs to go next? And he was livid. I have my daughters here too, because it's something that I think we need to I'm like you, Ijima. My daughter is like, Gia's like, she's like, Mom, everybody else has like their stuff probably hanging on the refrigerator or having she's like, mine's on the floor. Because I had fallen off the table. It was on the floor. We left it there. She's like, it's like, we don't even really care about this stuff. And I'm like, well, you know why? But this dad was really upset because his daughter scored level 1 out of 4 levels.
Okay.
And he said, I don't know why my daughter got promoted to the 6th grade. She should not be in the 6th grade. She performed at a level 1. We need to do something to change this. She is not performing at the level that she needs to. And I need to speak to somebody about what her classes are going to look like, what the expectations are going to be, what goals we have for her, because this is unacceptable. And, the other parents who were not there for this particular reason were all like, jumping on board, and I was like, wait a minute, what's happening here? And I don't even know if she was a receptionist. I don't know what her role was, but she said, it's one snapshot of your child's whole development. The teachers work with your child. They have a better understanding of what she can do and what her strengths are. So it's not dependent on this particular document. She said, and I think she even explained, this is what makes me question what her role was, but she talked about it being summative, that even in that particular case, or just knowing that in itself doesn't show, what his daughter doesn't know. It's, trying to minimize the significance of this experience, but they were all like on board with this. And so I jumped, to back her up. But I just thought for a moment, yes, there are lots of reasons why I disagree with, this, I agree with what we're saying about learning loss. And I'm just going to say it's a bunch of bullshit. Like, I agree with all of that, but to listen to the parents of how irate they were that their scores were so low just blows me away.
But see, Isela, I feel like that's the quandary right there. And it's back to the conspiracy theory too. We spend billions of dollars administering the test.
Oh, yeah.
Tons of instructional time preparing for the test. We get the results and a family member's like, hey, you all invested in this test. Now I have concerns. And our reaction is, it doesn't really tell us that much. It's not really that important. So which is it? Like, that's what bothers me at a deeper level. Because when you were telling that story, I'm like, well, which are we supposed to believe? That it's not accurate and it's not helpful? Then that's unethical to be spending our time doing it.
But I think this is unique to my daughter's school, which is why she goes there. Because the other schools that I have worked with, they put a lot of emphasis on these scores. There's a lot of conversations around preparing for the exam.
Sure.
Beforehand, the impact of students not performing well in terms of how much money they get and resources that they get. There's a huge emphasis on this process. So yeah. And then you add on that I can go on forever about this because it was, I think looking at it from a teacher perspective, because I am in elementary schools where they are feeling overwhelmed from the beginning, don't have autonomy, don't have choice about how to support their students. They are asked from day one to jump into academic learning and don't provide space for community building, connection, rules, routines. Like, they have to show that they're doing X, Y, and Z, all because of this, that we're leading to this assessment. And so there's data rooms. Schools literally have rooms that are dedicated to data. And so they get all of this pushed down on them. And what makes me sick about this whole situation is that last year was COVID. So they were virtual and they were still held accountable
Right.
to go through all of the standards. And no one, it was like, oh, too bad. We're going to still run these assessments and you're going to still be held accountable for what should have been happening virtually, which is crazy.
Juma, I could say 800 things. And
Go ahead.
I have to know, what is the pink thing behind you?
Oh, I think it's a suitcase, and that's the luggage tag.
Sorry, because I keep looking up and I
Sorry.
think you've got like, I think you keep, so you know how you can post like a little something,
Yeah.
like it would come
Sorry.
up, but
Sorry if that's
okay. No,
distracting.
no, no, it's okay. I just, every time I'm like, oh, what does she learn how to do on Be Live, you know? So Ijuma, where would you take Isala's story back to your, you know, conspiracy theory needing to have a styrofoam or a, it's really not styrofoam. What do
Tinfoil.
they need? Tinfoil. Yeah. Okay.
Um, so I think it's a both and that part of the problem is it's a systemic problem.
Right.
That those like tests and ECEs is assessments, right? Because assessments and how children do with the developmental assessments is tied to funding. And so people get very wound up about that and very focused on that. And even in preschool, parents like get the results and come in and say, well, my child
Mhm.
should be higher, or they're low, or I have a concern. I don't think they should go, to the next room. I think they need to stay in preschool and not move into pre-K.
Right.
But I think part that is a systemic problem that we need to deal with, and thinking about and being honest about the inequities that is actually based in. That is based for some children to be at the top and some children to be at the bottom. And most of the children are supposed to be at the bottom because that's how they make money, right? Because if everyone is doing great, right? If everyone is doing, where they should and learning at the paces they should be, there's no money in that. But it's money when we can say, well, they're not achieving, so here's the next product. Like it's tied to consumerism. Because here's the curriculum that's going to fix it, right? Or if you just go back to the standards, so here's the PD for the standards. And if we teacher proof the curriculum, then children will achieve these standards. But we know that that's not how development works. That's not how people actually grow cognitively,
right,
and academically. And so we have to have that conversation in ECE. We have to have it through K through 12. And we've just gone through COVID. Like, we can't forget about that. So to say, the first thing to say, well, there's been learning loss, like, that's not the loss that we actually should be focusing on. Like, there's been loss of life. There's been loss of routine. There's been a loss of a whole lifestyle. People's lives aren't the same.
Yeah.
And so worrying about if they can like meet the standards should actually be a lower priority. And that's the conversation that ideally we should be having, and that we shouldn't approach education from a deficit place and talk about children losing something. Right? We should be talking about their resilience, right? These are the children that made it through. These are the educators that made it through, that they're still showing up, right? After going through virtual and all that came with that, but they're still showing up. So like our language is important in how we view and talk about educators and talk about children, because when you say learning loss, then you're like, well, whose fault is that?
That's right.
People are pointing fingers. It's the parents, it's the teachers. But why?
Well, and I think let's stay on that for a minute, because it's like, oh, it's COVID. Well, at the time of this recording, it's not past tense.
Right.
So it's still a factor. And then secondly, like Isala, you've talked about with your daughter, some people thrived in a virtual or even a hybrid. And so it annoys me, somebody who can teach I hope, very effectively, remotely or digitally or distantly, to sort of put virtual and COVID as the same word for the implications on humans' development. And because you can do bad instruction in person and you can do bad instruction online. And so for me, it's those things you just said, Ijuma, that COVID has changed and disrupted, good or bad, our routines. Then certainly on the bad side, the loss of life, the loss of stability, the loss of family configurations that had to split up due to economic disadvantages, blah, blah, blah. Like, and we don't talk about that. We just go, oh, everybody had to be virtual, so it sucked for everybody. So everybody didn't learn for a year. So we have learning loss. So now let's get everybody back together in person so we can do it like we used to do it, because that was so effective. And then if you still aren't working, we'll have a separate space with a separate curriculum for you to catch up. Like for me, that we're just mixing it all together.
Mm-hmm. And this idea that remediation,
Yeah.
because that's the other, like, well, my
Remove
child
and
shouldn't go to
remediate.
the next grade, right? Like they
Yep.
should be held back. But actually, remediation doesn't work.
Ever.
Like none of the science, none of the research, you look it up, remediation never works.
Mm-hmm. You could say remove and remediate never works.
Yeah.
And so like that's the conversation that we need to be honest about with each other, and help people not engage in that fear tactic.
Right.
And be caught in their fear. Because they're worried like my child isn't going to be educated.
Yeah.
And like I send my child here and like that's what I want. Like my hopes and dreams are in the success of my child.
Yeah.
I think that's what's really hard for families, for parents, because so many, I just think of like the parents that I have worked with, wanting, right? It's like, I
Yes.
didn't have opportunities, and this is what I understand means success.
Yeah.
And I think it's really hard for folks to wrap their arms around and understanding that learning hasn't been lost. Like I don't even understand that concept, quite honestly, because I do come from, and I'm really thinking at like older kids. I like, this makes zero sense to me for under 5 years of age. Like zero, absolute.
But they're still using it, right?
I know. I just don't
using that
like,
language.
That's ridiculous to me. Like I can't even sugarcoat that crap. It's just, I don't even understand it. But when we're looking at, third grade, fifth grade, when we're looking at older kids, the idea, because I do come from such a holistic approach to understanding who every student is, who every child is, and then going, okay, what is it that we need to do to support their learning, growth, and development?
Right.
What are the things that student needs? Let's figure out how to approach that from a whole group perspective, from an individualized perspective, from a small group opportunity for learning. It's like it's a dance you have to be able to do effectively, so that everyone, that idea of inclusion, every single person is included, and that we have different places where kids can contribute to whatever it is that we're working on. So I'm looking at it through the lens of, especially my daughter at 13. I've got her test scores right here, and in English and in math, she had level 1, which is below. She was like below the level 1 for both of those, and that's not typically where she performs. She's actually in advanced English, and she got below level 1 in her scores. And she says, "Mom, maybe they made a mistake." She's like, "I'm in advanced English. I'm going to show up to school, and they're going to tell me I'm in the wrong class." But the truth of it is, because of where she goes to school, right? They understand who she is as a learner, and what she can do and where she is in terms of the next steps for her development. And they really look to support at that level. So I don't understand this idea of learning loss. I think it's getting to the core of what we believe about teaching and learning, period.
Mm-hmm. So let's take it this, but that our colleagues and friends and educators, even early childhood ones, are going to be hearing this at board meetings, at back to school rallies. Like, it's because of that fear that is just our go-to all school reform. I was reading an article this morning. I was surprised of what it said, but let me just give you a couple of examples of school reforms that just make my blood boil. They were saying that these are like going off, into the sunset. And I was glad to hear that, but I don't really see that. So, one of them was state takeovers of low performing schools.
We've seen that here.
We still see that, right? But they were like, oh, that's so passe. That was so Arnie Duncan. I'm like, I'm pretty sure it's still happening.
Yeah.
Evaluating teachers based on student test scores. Pretty sure it's happening.
Yep.
And even though all the research says that's the worst way,
yep.
Okay. And then flunking third graders who score below threshold on reading. I'm pretty sure there's still a third grade reading guarantee. So I was like, I don't know where you got your data. But let's just say that those were passe. Those were all fear-based. Basically, let's take the last one. If your kid can't read by the third grade, talk about remediation. We're just going to retain them till what? They grow facial hair and have to go to prison? I mean, I never understood that, right? So that pressure, and then I think you're right, Ijuma, like, who do we blame? And Isal, I'm thinking about that parent. They're like, I don't know how to read this. I don't know, understand this. And are you sure my kid is in the place that will support them most? Like, I say things, but how do we help educators have these conversations to say, there is no such thing as a boogeyman. The emperor has no clothes. There is no such thing as learning loss. Like, what could we say to people to then get some momentum behind that? So somebody says, oh, that is not true. Like, what could we say other than like, that's asinine and bullshit, right? Like, what else?
It always comes down to money. For me anyway,
I knew you
I'm
were
a
gonna say that.
consultant working in schools. I've had several principals say to me, Isela, I believe everything you're saying. You are absolutely right. I am not going to argue with you about what brain development looks like, about what learning should look like. How we're assessing is wrong. And so this is where we're trying to do a formative approach. And, it's like we're trying to do what we can do, but it comes down to this fear. It comes down to fear of losing funding. And I have to be real. I've got to put this out there because parents really want to see learning happening in a particular way. And so parents, a whole mob of parents show up at a board meeting. And, when there are schools trying to make some dynamic shifts, looking at some of the implications of practices that have not been great historically. And there's a big pushback, huge pushback. And now with, public school and charter schools, at least here in Arizona, they have so many options for schooling. And so parents just pull their children, there's like six schools. Whereas when I was coming up in school, we had our neighborhood school. And then there were private schools that you could choose if you, could afford it. But now in my neighborhood, in my neighborhood, there's like 10 schools to choose from.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think speaks to what you're saying before, Ijuma. It's just more separating and segregating and more distinctions between those systemic isms, because who's going to go where. And even if you get lucky and you get on an autism scholarship, maybe you have low SES, but you have autism. It's still taking public money out of public schools and suggesting public schools have an inability to meet the needs of kids, which some do. It's not false.
Mm-hmm. But I think we do a disservice as not having parents actually in community with us. And so when they're not in community, then that's when they have those meetings in the parking lot, and then, a mob mentality, pitchforks, and, down with this thing. right? But if we're in community with each other and we have ongoing conversation about philosophy, because a lot of schools like actually don't talk about what our actual philosophy is, because like parents don't want to hear that. But even if they don't want to hear it, it's always important to say and to show, like, here's how the learning is happening. Here's what we believe about children, about education, and not just at back to school night. That it should be ongoing in conversation and having, giving ways for parents to show up and being part of that community. And then when it's a problem, then they're more likely to like go talk to the administrator or go talk directly to the teacher before it gets out of hand.
So maybe one idea is to try, like you said, language has power. So try not to use these fear-based language around learning loss, but instead talk about, here's how we are going to support learners. This is what to expect. This is how we do it. This is where we do it. Like just being overt about some things so that we're not ignoring that we're trying to educate through a pandemic. I don't know. I was trying to pull out a couple of things that you said there, Ijuma. It's like not trying to, even if we have that fear that Isela said that building principal did, not buying into it and using the language. And
then also not being afraid of parents, right? So like parents are going to be upset about things and they're going to bring that. I think in ECE we have more practice with that because parents come and talk to us all the time, but it's a different in K through 12. And then principals and teachers are afraid of parents. And like soon as somebody complains, then everything falls apart. And like, oh well, we need to do what families want. But actually, a lot of things are negotiable. That just means that you need to renegotiate what our agreement is about having your child in the school, and talking through that. We're not going to change and create harm if we're dismantling systems that are harmful and practices that are harmful. We're not going to go back to those harmful practices just because the parent gets upset.
Right.
But a lot of places that's what they do.
Exactly. Even
and that's why parents, organize around and say we don't like this, and then like things get changed, and then they get changed back because it becomes harmful, and something bad usually happens, and then they have to back down, and then the cycle starts all over again. But like part of the bravery about being an administrator and being an educator is having those hard conversations and not falling apart when someone is upset. Like that fear of conflict. Like there's going to be conflict. You have to expect conflict and know how to work through that. Have a plan to work through the conflict.
My experience in when I was an administrator in early childhood programs, all of my programs that I was administrator were crisis intervention programs. And so we did a lot of work with families because they were comprehensive programs. So we had very close relationships with families. And so there were so many opportunities to engage in that kind of dialogue. But I see such a different experience now that I'm in, the K on up world, just how different from a cultural perspective, organizational culture, from the climate, from coming from a place of, you talk about community, like in an early childhood program, that was one of our goals, was to build community with our families, particularly because we had a lot of families who weren't connected, didn't have other family members. Some of them were immigrant families. Some of them, we had so many different backgrounds coming into our program. So that building that sense of community was a really important part, I think, of our success. In an elementary public school, it is such a different climate, and there is a deficit. There is a deficit model. And it's also, this is what we do, right? This is what we do, and this is what we say. We can't meet the needs of your child, so there's a school up the street that you can go to. And so it's a real different just climate, I think, even for teachers who, like, I did a kindergarten project for 5 years trying to change kindergarten, get blocks back in kindergarten, but
Mhm.
dramatic play back in kindergarten, play as the primary modality for learning in kindergarten. That was all supported by the Department of Education in Arizona. And the pushback I got was ridiculous.
Oh,
Teachers
yeah.
get so excited. We get to do what we know is best for children, right? But no, they can't. It's like their hands were tied because administrators didn't have either a deep understanding or believed that children could actually learn this way. There was fear around that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, even with the conversations, the dialogue, many of the teachers we work with ended up leaving because then now they had this is what's best for kids and we can't do it. So what are we going to do?
Well, I think unfortunately, Isela, so many preschools are increasingly in public school buildings, especially programs for children on IEPs. And then if you want those to be inclusive at all, and so then that just gets pushed right down to kids who've just turned 2.5.
Mm-hmm.
I see that too.
Yeah, I hear you. And I feel like, that a few months ago when we were talking about lessons learned through the pandemic was the importance of the partnership and the community with families. And I just see that's so yesterday, like when we cared what was happening. Now we're like, we got them back. Let's just get the learning gap closed. So let's think a little bit about when people say learning loss, and then we'll kind of begin to wrap this up. Like, what could we say instead? And when we say we know how kids really learn and that they'd still learned during the year of mixture of delivery, what do we mean by that?
I don't know what your question is. Like, what did they gain from that experience?
Like, what do we really know how people learn? And how kids learn, so that when you said, Isela, like, what did they lose? Like, what do we really mean that you could still learn? Sorry, I can't say it better.
I think what people are holding on to is, what you should know by first grade, what you should know by third grade, what you should know by sixth grade, the standards. That's what people are holding on to.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of looking at what the strengths of the student, the child is, where those strengths are, what they have learned. Because, one of the articles, I think you shared this article, it talked about all the things that children did learn. I think teachers too. Folks didn't know how to use technology at the level that they do now.
Right.
Learning how to be in a Zoom together and being able to articulate ideas virtually and wait your turn because you can't all talk at one time. There's so many little nuances that I think we just dismissed as not an important part of the learning process because it doesn't look like the standards say that they should be learning.
That's helpful.
That's where we're holding on to that idea that by this time, this is what a student needs to know. And that's, if you let go of that. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm. No, but like letting go of that. So going through this pandemic actually showed us that it's just not one way.
Yeah.
There's just not one way to do learning. There's not just one way, right? Because they said it was impossible for children to learn virtually and do things and adapt when that wasn't true.
Right. Even for very young children.
Even for very
you
young
talk
children.
to any early educator, I am just stupefied by their brilliance and ability to, I've seen a million circle times that were total chaos in real life. And I've seen the most beautiful gatherings of and ingenuity and creativity and flexibility. And you're right. We haven't thought enough about that or celebrated that or the resilience of that. Mm-hmm.
What was beautiful, I saw this a few times actually, where the one particular district was meeting virtually. These were 3 to 5 year old children. So they were doing virtual group times and that sort of thing. And they were a school that actually went back in person before everybody else did. So I think by school started in August. By November, end of October, November, they were all back in session. And so, and these were kiddos who had, special needs, who are on IEP. They're the ones who they opened up the district to. And what was amazing to watch was because they had some connection virtually already with people. And then the teachers were showing the classroom, like walking through with the camera, showing where their cubbies were and how to walk into the school. And, we did some like where they would hide things and they would have to go find them on the first day of school. And so they got to school like they already had been there. Like they were already experts because they knew each other. They knew the teacher. They'd seen them on the, on the virtual class, in the virtual classroom. I would have never thought that would actually work had I not seen it. It was amazing to me. And they said consistently, the teachers, like, they just went right into the routine. Our morning song was the same. They just knew what to do. And that blew me away.
Yeah. Oh,
and so those are the stories that we have to tell and that we have to highlight and to remind people, like, learning happens. So much learning happened.
Yeah.
It just wasn't the learning that we expected. It wasn't the learning that was written down because it wasn't meant for this time.
Yeah.
And so it actually...
That's part of it, Ijima, is letting go of what's familiar and comfortable to us.
Yeah.
And children show that they're resilient.
Yeah, absolutely.
And together we can figure it out.
Yeah. And so I feel like our invitation as we close up this episode is to really encourage our colleagues and out there to, when they hear these phrases, whether it's kindergarten readiness or learning loss or achievement gap or standards-based IEPs, any of these things that just have that overtone of fear and worry and reaction, just to pause and say, what's really true here? And I think that's what I would love for a couple of teachers to come into community and say, what's really true here? And do it for your age group. So let's say you've got 13-year-olds. What's really true of our 12-year-olds who are now 13? What did they really learn during last year and experience? For 3-year-olds, what's really true here? And I think when you boil it down, all of those examples you gave, Ijima, it was the routine, the predictability, the relationship, the connection. The kids were in the green zone of optimal learning. Who's surprised? We're a little bit surprised because maybe we don't give kids enough credit. Maybe, like you said, it's our own fear, our own comfort. And we're like, we wouldn't feel comfortable doing that. That's not how we did it. But look at that. Look at that.
I think that, when folks go, oh, there's been so much learning loss, or, oh, there's been so many things that didn't go right. I think for me anyway, when somebody says to me, because I work with kids with exhibiting challenging behaviors. And I go into classrooms, they're like, well, he did this and he did this and he did this. And I go, so what makes him an amazing human being?
Yeah.
So when someone says, look at all the things that didn't go right, I think having like this phrase that maybe it's, but look at the incredible things we did learn. But let me share with you what was incredible this year.
Yeah.
Like if you have a way to just respond to that.
Love it.
And I would add to know it for yourself. Yeah. What are the amazing things that you learned? Where did you grow?
Yeah.
What did you think was impossible, but you made possible?
Yeah.
And really celebrate that because, man, like you said, Ijima, they keep showing up, right? These amazing educators. And we just keep going and keep going. And just to take a moment and go, wow, look at all that I did and held together and was creative and still connected with my kids. And like you said, Isela, they came in person. It was like we didn't skip a beat, but we don't share those stories. All we do is publish articles about critical race theory is making white children sad. And, learning loss is the new orange or black or whatever color's good, right? Like, it's like, come on, like give us all just like stop with all of that and And I think though it comes down for me back to conspiracy theory. It's just, we don't want systemic change. We don't really, we white people don't really want, or those that have the power, or those that have the money. So let's do something over here that distracts you from actually going, hey, maybe we could do things differently without a curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we actually thrived without standards.
Mhm.
And maybe when we partnered with families, we were better off than when we kept them out in the parking lot. Maybe.
Yeah.
All right.
So yay team.
Yay team. Get with your friends. As Eugenia said, practice it. As Isela said, switch it, say it differently, reframe it, and then find some bravery in those pairs or small groups. And when you hear people saying there's learning loss, speak your own truth and say, this is what's, it's always thing for you when you hear, when people say things, go, well, that hasn't been the case for me, or that hasn't been my experience. So if somebody's talking about the learning loss of your students, you can say, well, being with them in the classroom every day, even if it's through Google, whatever, that wasn't my experience. How powerful would that be? All right, we're going to go try it.
Yes.
Anything in closing? Anything in closing, friends, that you'd like to stay or state or restate or invite?
I right now I'm just feeling a lot of gratitude. And just holding the space for everyone to go into this new school year renewed. And know that, if you think that you don't have any support, you have 3 people right here that can support you, right? Like no one is alone.
No one is alone. Isela?
I think one of the things when I was working on my dissertation, I had my mentor said to me when I started to feel like I couldn't do it. I don't know how many of us were like, they're going to find out I know nothing, right? I mean, yeah. And so he used to say to me, courage is always available.
Oh,
and that was life-changing for me. I still use it in so many things that I do. And so that idea that when it's scary, when it's overwhelming, when it's hard, courage is always available.
Yes.
Beautiful.
Yay.
All right. Thank you. All right, Ijima, don't forget the plug. Tell everybody to follow us on YouTube.
Yes, follow us on YouTube, like and subscribe.
And share.
And share.
And share. Yeah.
All right. Thanks,
Share
y'all.
with your friends.